The footage stopped at exactly 14 seconds and no one in the room spoke. It wasn't supposed to be remarkable. The projector hummed softly, its fan pushing warm air into the windowless Pentagon briefing room, while the frozen frame cast a washed-out jungle image across the screen. Green layered upon green, shadow swallowing detail. To the untrained eye was nothing. Just another patrol captured on grainy reconnaissance film. Another moment in a war measured in thousands of patrols, thousands of contacts, thousands of decisions made in places most people would never see. But the men in that room were not untrained eyes. They were analysts drawn from across the most sophisticated military intelligence structure on Earth, Army Special Operations planners, Marine Corps doctrine specialists, Air Force reconnaissance interpreters, civilian behavioral analysts whose entire careers revolved around decoding human movement in combat. Between them sat over 200 years of accumulated operational experience. They had studied Soviet maneuver doctrine, Chinese infiltration tactics, insurgent cell structures from Malaya to Algeria. They understood how humans fought, how they hid, how they hunted, and how they died. And yet none of them could explain what they had just watched. The colonel, seated near the center, leaned forward, elbows on the table, fingers pressed against his lips. His nameplate sat angled beside a stack of folders, its polished surface reflecting the frozen jungle image. "Run it again," he said quietly. The technician nodded, rewinding the reel. The projector clicked. The film began to move. The patrol entered the frame from the left, 5 figures. Their shapes are barely distinguishable from the terrain around them. Australian SAS. Their silhouettes were broken up by camouflage that mirrored the jungle itself. Not just the pattern, the posture, the spacing, the rhythm. They moved slowly, slower than American patrol doctrine recommended, painfully slow. The analyst standing near the screen spoke as the footage played. Joint Reconnaissance Patrol, Australian lead element, American advisory team trailing approximately 80 meters behind. Standard staggered file formation. Standard. Everything about it appeared standard, until it wasn't. At 7 seconds, the lead Australian stopped, not abruptly, gradually, as if responding to something that hadn't happened yet. The man behind him froze instantly, his rifle already angled toward a section of brush that, to everyone watching in the Pentagon briefing room, looked identical to everything around it. The patrol did not speak, did not signal, did not move. 5 seconds passed. Nothing happened. The colonel frowned. Pause. The image froze again. He stood, walking closer to the screen. What triggered that halt? No one answered, because there was no visible trigger, no movement in the vegetation, no sound indicated on the audio track, no sign of enemy presence. The patrol simply knew. Continue. The film resumed. At 12 seconds, the lead Australian moved, not forward, not backward, sideways. One slow step, then another. His rifle never wavered. At 14 seconds, the jungle exploded. Gunfire tore through the exact space where he had been standing moments before. Muzzle flashes burst from concealed positions, invisible even now on the slowed footage. An ambush, perfectly positioned to kill him, except he wasn't there anymore. The Australians reacted instantly, not with panic, not with surprise, with execution. Controlled return fire, precise, minimal, devastating. The ambush collapsed in less than 9 seconds. 9 seconds. The projector clicked off. The room went silent again. One of the civilian analysts broke it first. How did he know? It wasn't asked rhetorically. It was asked because it required an answer. The Marine Corps major flipped open the after-action report in front of him. No prior indicators, no detected movement, no intercepted communications. The American advisory element reported no awareness of enemy presence until engagement was initiated. He looked up. They were walking into a kill zone, and he stepped out of it before it happened. The colonel's eyes remained fixed on the screen. Run it again. They watched it 3 more times. Each viewing answered nothing. Finally, someone spoke about the question that would linger long after the meeting ended. Who taught them that? The words hung in the air because they implied something deeply unsettling. Doctrine was taught. Technique was taught. Tactics were documented, standardized, disseminated. Nothing in modern military operations existed without lineage. Everything had a source, everything had a logic. But this had neither. An intelligence officer cleared his throat. The Australians have operated in jungle environments for decades. Malaya, Borneo, Vietnam. The colonel nodded slowly. Yes, we have too, and yet they had never seen this. Not like this. The difference wasn't experience, it was an interpretation. The American advisory team's debrief transcript sat in the folder on the table. One line had been underlined. We didn't see anything. Another line followed. They did. That was the part no one could quantify. The Americans were highly trained observers. Their selection process eliminated over 80% of candidates. They were taught to detect pattern anomalies, environmental disturbances, behavioral tells invisible to conventional forces. And still, they had seen nothing, while the Australians had seen enough. The colonel returned to his seat. Is there any indication they had prior knowledge of enemy positioning? The intelligence officer shook his head. No intercepted transmissions, no forward reconnaissance elements, no aerial overwatch warning. He hesitated. They reacted to something present in the environment. The colonel leaned back. Something present, but invisible. Around the table, the analysts sat with a realization none of them voiced directly. This wasn't luck. Luck didn't produce consistency. Luck didn't produce documented operational success rates like the SAS patrol units were reporting. In multiple jungle deployments, their patrols were detecting ambush positions at distances and timelines statistically inconsistent with probability models. They weren't surviving ambushes. They were sidestepping them. Regularly, one analyst flipped through another report. "Sir, this isn't isolated." He slid the document forward. "Similar incidents. Different patrols, same outcome." The colonel didn't touch it. He didn't need to. He understood what it meant. This wasn't a single anomaly. It was a pattern. And patterns meant systems, which meant doctrine, which meant something existed that they did not yet understand. For an institution built on understanding, that was the most dangerous possibility of all. Because the United States military had been fighting in jungles for years, and somehow they had been fighting alongside a capability they had never fully seen, or never fully recognized. The projector screen went dark, leaving only reflections of the men staring back at themselves. In that moment, the question wasn't just who taught them that, it was why no one else had learned it. The anomaly did not begin in the jungle. It began on a strip of Turkish coastline in 1915, where young men from a distant continent learned what it meant to fight without margin. At Gallipoli, the soldiers of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps were not operating with overwhelming firepower or deep reserves. They were clinging to cliffs under artillery fire, supply lines thin, evacuation uncertain, survival dependent less on grand maneuver than on small groups of men adapting hour by hour to terrain that punished rigidity. Gallipoli was, in strategic terms, a failure, but culturally, it etched something permanent into Australian military identity: endurance without guarantee, improvisation under constraint, skepticism toward distant command, optimism. That inheritance matured in the Pacific during the Second World War. In the mud and razor grass of Kokoda Track, Australian units fought a grinding jungle campaign against Japanese forces advancing south. There were no vast armored thrusts here, no sweeping mechanized arcs. There were platoon-sized clashes along ridgelines so narrow that two men could not walk abreast. Supply was carried on backs, casualties were dragged down slopes by hand, disease rates rivaled combat losses. In some sectors, more than 50% of unit strength rotated out due to malaria, dysentery, or exhaustion before bullets found them. And again, adaptation determined survival. Australian commanders learned to decentralize authority, not as a philosophical preference but as a practical necessity. In jungle terrain, communications fail. Visibility collapses. Junior leaders must decide without waiting for approval. Corporals became tacticians. Sergeants became strategists. The institutional lesson was clear. A force operating far from home, with limited mass and limited resupply, must cultivate independent thinking at the lowest level or risk annihilation. By the time the Malayan emergency erupted in 1948, this pattern was not theory, it was muscle memory. Operating alongside British units against communist insurgents in dense equatorial forest, Australian forces refined a quiet craft. Patrols were smaller, loads were lighter, intelligence came not from satellites but from relationships, local trackers, informants, pattern recognition. Ambushes were deliberate and patient. Weeks could pass without contact, then violence would unfold in seconds. Unlike industrial-scale wars fought by superpowers, these campaigns offered no decisive battles. They were contests of stamina and subtlety. Ratios mattered differently. A patrol that eliminated 3 insurgents after a 10-day insertion was not a minor skirmish. It was a strategic disruption. In counterinsurgency mathematics, small numbers echo. When Australia entered Vietnam, they did so not as a mirror image of American doctrine, but as an extension of this lineage. In Phuoc Tri Province, Australian task force units emphasized dispersed patrol bases, long-duration reconnaissance, and minimal signature operations. While American forces often relied on large-scale search-and-destroy missions supported by heavy artillery and air mobility, Australian units preferred what one officer described as quiet pressure. Move unseen, observe, strike surgically, withdraw before the terrain itself turned hostile. The contrast was not about courage or competence, it was architectural. The United States military evolved as a continental power. Its wars, particularly in the 20th century, were defined by scale logistical dominance, industrial output, overwhelming fire support. Doctrine first, resources second. Field manuals standardized behavior so that battalions rotating across theaters could integrate seamlessly. It was a model that excelled in open terrain and high-intensity conflict. When America commits force, it commits deeply. Australia's military identity developed differently. Geographically isolated, population limited, expeditionary by necessity, it could never rely on mass. Its doctrine evolved from constraint. Resources were finite, reinforcements were distant. Every deployment carried the understanding that improvisation was not deviation, it was survival. This is the quiet inheritance that later puzzled Pentagon analysts. In modern coalition environments, Australia often appeared numerically small. But within certain operational theaters, jungles, littoral zones, counterinsurgency grids, their units displayed a tactical autonomy that did not align neatly with American command frameworks. Patrol reports were less verbose, equipment configurations diverged from standardized templates. Junior leaders exercised discretion that in other militaries might require higher approval. To American planners trained in centralized synchronization, this could look irregular. Why were patrol elements operating with fewer support assets? Why were certain engagements resolved without immediate request for air cover? Why did Australian after-action reports emphasize terrain patterns and human atmospherics over grid-coordinated fire missions? The answer was not negligence, it was an inheritance. An Australian infantry section commander, raised within a culture that celebrated Gallipoli resilience and Kokoda endurance, did not instinctively reach for overwhelming force. He calculated differently. He weighed noise against advantage. He assessed whether calling artillery would solve a problem or simply announce his position to a wider network. In environments where insurgents melted into villages or jungle corridors within minutes, restraint could be as decisive as aggression. This cultural architecture extended beyond tactics into psychology. Australian military mythology does not revolve around technological supremacy. It revolves around mateship under pressure, sardonic humor in adversity, distrust of excessive formality. Authority exists, but it is often expressed laterally rather than vertically. Officers are expected to earn credibility not through rank alone, but through demonstrated competence in the same mud and heat as their soldiers. In practical terms, this produced units comfortable with ambiguity, comfortable operating without immediate oversight, comfortable making decisions that could not be neatly summarized in doctrinal checklists. For American counterparts, this sometimes generated cognitive friction. In joint planning rooms, where PowerPoint slides mapped phases in color-coded precision, Australian representatives might propose a leaner alternative: fewer vehicles, longer reconnaissance windows, greater reliance on human terrain familiarity. To analysts accustomed to quantifiable metrics, this approach felt intangible. Where were the measurable inputs, the guaranteed redundancies? Yet history suggested a different metric. From Malaya through Vietnam and into contemporary Middle Eastern and Pacific deployments, Australian units consistently demonstrated casualty ratios and mission completion rates that defied their size. In certain counterinsurgency rotations, their patrols averaged longer field durations with lower logistical footprint than coalition peers, less visible, less dependent, more embedded. What confused some American observers was not recklessness, it was independence. The Australian military was never designed to fight the way America fights because it never possessed the same structural assumptions. It did not build doctrine around inexhaustible resupply or layered air dominance. It is built around adaptability and trust at the small unit level, around the belief that terrain dictates behavior more than manuals do. In jungle environments especially, this inheritance manifested almost as instinct. Boots placed carefully on root systems to avoid leaving traces, radios kept silent unless necessary, patrol spacing adjusted by feel rather than strict interval measurement. The jungle was not an obstacle to be overwhelmed, it was a medium to be absorbed into. This is the architecture that produced the tactical anomaly. Not a deviation from modern warfare, but a parallel civilization within it. And once you understand that inheritance, once you trace the line from Gallipoli cliffs to Pacific ridgelines to Southeast Asian jungles, the confusion begins to dissolve. What appeared irregular was in fact consistent. What seemed unorthodox was tradition carried forward. The Australians were not improvising because they lacked doctrine. They were improvising because their doctrine demanded it. The confusion did not begin with failure, it began with success. In briefing rooms thousands of miles away, analysts stared at engagement reports that made operational sense on paper and none at all in process. Patrols of 5 and 6 men were producing disruption rates comparable to American elements, twice their size. Contact durations were shorter. Ammunition expenditure was lower. Casualty figures, both inflicted and absorbed, fell outside expected ratios. Nothing in the outcome data triggered alarm. It was the absence of visible scaffolding behind those outcomes that unsettled the Pentagon. Because when American commanders traced backward from result to method, they found gaps. No layered authorization chains for engagement. No elaborate communications web tying patrols to airborne command nodes. No constant position updates plotted every 15 minutes. In some cases, radio silence extended for hours beyond what U.S. doctrine classified as acceptable risk tolerance. Yet the patrols returned, and they returned with effect. On the ground, that effect began with something deceptively simple. Decision-making architecture compressed almost to a single mind. In American special operations, authority is structured like a reinforced lattice. A team leader commands, but the intelligence sergeant contributes pattern analysis, the weapons sergeant advises on fire application, the communications sergeant manages the network. Decisions are collaborative under pressure. Situational awareness is distributed deliberately so no single failure collapses the structure. The Australian patrol inverted that logic. Decision authority lived almost entirely with the patrol commander. Not because the others lacked competence, but because fragmentation of cognition was viewed as leakage. Every additional whispered consultation risked noise. Every moment of debate risked hesitation, and hesitation in close jungle terrain could stretch seconds into exposure. A U.S. advisor once described it as watching a man play chess without telling the pieces why they're moving. He meant it critically at first. Later, he meant it with reluctant respect. The patrol commander absorbed terrain, threat assessment, extraction contingencies, and timing internally. His men did not demand explanation. They read tempo shifts through micro-signals, the tightening of shoulders, the slight alteration in pace, the way he angled his rifle before cresting a rise. Initiative did not disappear under this model, it relocated. Each man executed with autonomy inside the commander's intent without requiring constant clarification. To American observers, this felt dangerously opaque. To the Australians, it felt efficient. The divergence sharpened during contact escalation. American doctrine teaches dominance through volume. Immediate action drills are built around overwhelming force suppressive fire, maneuver elements bounding forward or peeling back, radio calls expanding the battle space to include air or artillery if available. Engagement is not merely reaction, it is assertion. You escalate fast to control the narrative of violence. The Australians treated escalation as failure. If contact lasted more than a minute, something had already gone wrong. Their protocol favored what could be described as surgical disruption, short, precise bursts, target discrimination in seconds, then displacement not directly backward, which pursuit patterns anticipate, but laterally, often at a right angle to the axis of engagement. The objective was not to dominate ground, it was to fracture enemy certainty. In one recorded engagement, a 6-man patrol encountered an armed logistics group along a narrow track. American observers expected a deliberate ambush, claymores positioned, interlocking arcs prepared. Instead, the Australians waited until the column compressed naturally at a choke point. 3 shots, 2 seconds of chaos, no follow-up volley. Within 45 seconds, the patrol had shifted 200 meters uplope. Later intercepts revealed the enemy unit reporting contact with an unknown number of attackers. Estimates ranged from 10 to 20. In reality, it had been 6. Confusion was multiplied by restraint. This is where Pentagon confusion deepened. The metrics defied familiar correlation, fewer rounds fired, yet disproportionate psychological impact. Shorter engagements, yet longer-term disruption. American models were built on the assumption that visible force application equaled influence. The Australians operated on a different assumption. Perception of omnipresence was more destabilizing than demonstrated strength. Their initiative culture reinforced this philosophy. At the patrol level, deviation from the initial plan was not an exception requiring higher authorization. It was an expectation. Terrain dictated movement more than pre-mission overlays. If a gain trail offered superior concealment but deviated from the original azimuth, the commander adjusted without consultation. If a suspected enemy movement corridor appeared colder than anticipated, they shifted observation posts rather than forcing contact to justify deployment. To U.S. analysts, this looked like procedural looseness. Inside the Australian framework, it was a disciplined adaptation. The difference lay in institutional conditioning. American units operated within an ecosystem of enablers, satellite feeds, quick reaction forces, medevac grids plotted with precision. The system rewarded synchronization. Every movement ideally fit within a larger operational mosaic. The Australians assumed isolation. They trained as if support would not arrive in time to matter. Helicopters were assets, not guarantees. Artillery was rare. Communications could fail beneath canopy density. Therefore, each patrol functioned as a closed system, self-contained, self-extracting, self-correcting. When American officers asked why radio updates were so sparse, one Australian commander answered simply, "Because if we're talking, we're being heard." It was not paranoia. Jungle acoustics are deceptive. Sound travels unpredictably through layered vegetation. A raised voice can ricochet through trunks and vines, arriving distorted yet traceable. Even radio transmissions carry electronic signatures. American doctrine mitigated this risk with encryption and power management. The Australians mitigated it by minimizing transmission altogether. Silence was not an absence of control. It was control exercised inwardly. This absence of procedural scaffolding unsettled senior American commanders most. They were accustomed to dashboards, position markers, frequency check-ins, scheduled reports. Those mechanisms created psychological assurance at higher headquarters. When Australian patrols operated beyond those rhythms, it induced unease disproportionate to actual risk. Because control in modern military culture is often equated with visibility, the Australians discoupled the two. Their methods worked because they were built on assumptions invisible to analysts trained elsewhere. They assumed the jungle neutralized technological overmatch. They assumed small signatures survived longer than loud assertions. They assumed fear propagated faster than bullets when ambiguity was preserved. They assumed that endurance, not firepower, determined operational longevity. And critically, they assumed that risk could not be engineered away. American frameworks are built on risk mitigation through layers. More sensors, more redundancy, more communication. The Australian assumption was stark. In certain terrain, additional layers increase detectability. Each layer adds weight, noise, and electromagnetic presence, so they stripped away layers until what remained felt almost austere. The cognitive friction for observers was acute. Familiar outcomes, enemy disruption, territorial denial, intelligence gained indirectly through behavioral shifts, were achieved through a process that appeared dangerously minimalist. Admiration crept in slowly, often against institutional pride. One Pentagon analyst reviewing cumulative engagement data noted that Australian patrols averaged 30 to 50% fewer rounds expended per confirmed enemy casualty compared to US counterparts in similar terrain. The statistic was dry on paper. In the field, it translated to shorter exposure, lighter loads, fewer resupply missions, reduced detection. Efficiency, not as technological superiority but as subtraction. Yet this subtraction carried cost. The psychological burden on patrol commanders was immense. Concentrated decision authority meant concentrated consecrated. A misjudged step, a misread trail sign, could not be diffused across committee. The silence that protected them also isolated them. Initiative at that level required confidence bordering on defiance. And defiance within alliance structures breeds discomfort. Comprehension did not arrive as an endorsement. It arrived as uneasy recognition that multiple operating systems could coexist and that one was not inherently superior simply because it was larger. By the time senior American officers stopped describing the methods as reckless, another realization had already taken root. If such effectiveness emerged from assumptions so fundamentally different from US doctrine, then the question was no longer whether the tactics worked. It was whether institutional systems were capable of absorbing lessons that challenged their own architecture. Because admiration is easy in hindsight, integration is hindsight, and somewhere between those two truths lies the reason the confusion never fully disappeared, even after understanding did. The pattern did not begin in the Middle East. It began in humidity so thick it felt like a second skin, in terrain that swallowed sound and distorted distance, in a war that most institutions still struggle to narrate honestly. Vietnam was not supposed to be a proving ground for tactical divergence. It was supposed to be a coalition effort under American gravity. More than 2.7 million US service members would rotate through that conflict over a decade. The machinery of Washington, the doctrine of overwhelming firepower, the metrics of body counts and sortie rates, all of it radiated outward from American command structures. And yet, inside that vast architecture, a smaller formation moved differently. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, just over 100 advisors, at its peak in-country strength operated in a way that American liaison officers would later describe with careful, almost evasive language. They were technically advisors, embedded, attached to South Vietnamese units, no battalions of their own. No artillery battalions on call by default, no dedicated helicopter fleet hovering overhead. On paper, they were numerically insignificant. In practice, they were conducting a form of small unit warfare that contradicted the assumptions dominating American strategy at the time. Picture a patrol in Phuoc Thu province just before dawn. The air smells of wet vegetation and cordite residue from yesterday's contact. Leeches cling to socks beneath jungle boots. Visibility stretches maybe 20 meters before dissolving into green opacity. An American advisor, attached for a temporary exchange, walks forth in the file. He is accustomed to radio chatter, constant updates, grids transmitted, aviation assets stacked in holding patterns. He expects noise to equal control. Instead, there is silence. The Australian Patrol Commander halts without a hand signal, as if the jungle itself has spoken. The column compresses instinctively. No whispered debate, no map-check theatrics, just stillness so complete the American can hear his own pulse. They wait. Not minutes, longer. It feels wasteful to Americans. Time equals vulnerability in his mental equation. But here, time is being weaponized. When movement finally resumes, it is angled not directly toward the suspected Viet Cong position, but off-axis, using terrain folds invisible on standard-issue maps. The Americans would later record that Australian units in Phuoc 2 maintained contact ratios that often exceeded projections, fewer friendly casualties per engagement, relative to confirmed enemy contact. Not because they fought less, because they chose when to fight. It was patience as doctrine. American after-action summaries praised jungle craft and small unit initiative, but the phrasing rarely dissected the mechanism. Liaison reports noted outcomes, successful ambushes, minimal friendly loss, intelligence captured intact. What they did not explain was the underlying philosophy: control the tempo, not by overwhelming force, but by denying the enemy predictability. That approach ran counter to the dominant American reliance on firepower as a problem solver. In Vietnam, U.S. units conducted over 7 million tons of aerial ordnance delivery across the war. Helicopter mobility defined the American experience: rapid insertion, rapid extraction, constant resupply. The Australians moved slower, quieter, often without an immediate aviation umbrella, and American officers noticed, not publicly, not in doctrinal memos circulated through the Pentagon, but in private requests. There is a pattern buried in personnel records from the late 1960s, U.S. officers requesting extended attachment to Australian units beyond initial liaison timelines. Some cited operational exposure. Others used the bureaucratic phrase cross-training opportunity. What they were seeking was immersion in a method that felt different, less industrial, more intimate. The Australians did not write a curriculum explaining what they were doing. They did not publish a manifesto on jungle minimalism. They simply operated. In one documented engagement near Nui Dat, an Australian platoon maneuvered for nearly 12 hours to set conditions for a 15-minute contact. The American liaison attached that day later described the operation as anticlimactic in duration, disproportionate in effect. 2 enemy killed. No friendly casualties, no air support was expended. The American expectation had been artillery prep, helicopter gunships, aggressive clearing. Instead, there was geometry, patience, and an ambush so precisely staged it felt inevitable rather than explosive. These were the laboratories, though no one used that word, because laboratories imply experimentation, and experimentation implies deviation from approved doctrine. Formally, coalition cohesion remained intact. Public praise flowed. The Australians were commended for professionalism, courage, reliability. But praise is not the same as comprehension. The Americans described the results. They did not fully explain methods. Years later, another theater, East Timor, 1999. Different jungle, different political context. The violence here was not conventional insurgency but militia-driven chaos following a referendum. The multinational force assembled under Australian leadership interfetant of territory already fractured by intimidation and reprisal killings. This time the Australians were not embedded under American operational dominance. They were leading, US not. Liaison officers arrived expecting familiar structures, robust supply chains, overwhelming presence, visible deterrence through mass. Instead, they observed something subtler. Delhi's streets smelled of smoke and sea salt. Buildings scarred by arson. Civilians watching from doorways with the wary stillness of people who have learned not to trust uniforms. Australian patrols moved in small numbers through volatile neighborhoods without theatrical display of force, weapons visible but not brandished. Engagement posture alert but deliberately unprovocative. It was calibrated dominance firm enough to deter militia probing, restrained enough to avoid inflaming civilian fear. An American major attached to the headquarters later wrote that Australian achieved area stabilization metrics ahead of projected timeline despite limited heavy asset availability. Translation: fewer armored vehicles, fewer aircraft, yet measurable reduction in violent incidents within weeks. How? Again, the liaison report focused on outcomes. Militia activity decreased by a reported 30% in certain districts within the first month of sustained patrol presence. Civilian displacement slowed. Intelligence from local communities increased. What the report did not unpack was the behavioral nuance, the way Australian junior officers negotiated with village elders without an entourage, the refusal to escalate minor confrontations into kinetic demonstrations, the deliberate use of foot patrols where vehicle convoys might have signaled occupation rather than security. For American observers conditioned by decades of force protection doctrine emphasizing distance and armor, it was counterintuitive. Proximity increases risk, unless proximity builds legitimacy. Again, personnel patterns tell the quieter story. Requests for extended liaison assignments. Informal feedback praising cultural fluency. Senior U.S. officers visiting and leaving with measured language that avoided implying doctrinal gap, yet internally commissioning reviews of small unit stabilization methods. There was no grand announcement that a tactical divergence had been validated, no symposium declaring Australian doctrine superior, but within two distinct theatres, Vietnam's jungle insurgency and East Timor's stabilization mission, the same characteristics appeared. Control through patience, presence without theatrical mass, violence applied precisely, rarely performatively. In Vietnam, that approach reduced friendly casualties relative to engagement frequency in certain provinces. In East Timor, it reduced civilian hostility during a politically volatile transition. Different conflicts, same signature, and still no formal curriculum was exported to allies. Why? Part of it was scale. Australia's entire Vietnam commitment peaked at around 8,000 personnel, tiny compared to American deployment. Institutional inertia favors the larger force. The United States possessed the machinery to write doctrine, to publish field manuals, to codify lessons. But codification often flattens nuance. What Australian units practiced was not easily translatable into checklist form. It required a cultural predisposition toward restraint coupled with lethal competence, a comfort operating with fewer enablers, a tolerance for ambiguity. These traits are hard to mass-produce. In East Timor, American observers noted that Australian commanders appeared unusually comfortable delegating decision authority to captains and lieutenants in fluid street environments. That decentralization looked risky through a U.S. lens shaped by legal review layers and political oversight. Yet it produced agility. Again, formal American praise avoided specifics. Public statements highlighted coalition success. Private briefings acknowledged adaptive small unit leadership. The gap between language and reality widened, because to fully explain what was happening would require admitting that effectiveness sometimes increases as visible power decreases, and that admission unsettles institutions built on scale. These theaters were not anomalies, they were iterative refinements. Vietnam provided the crucible of jungle insurgency, long-duration patrols, intelligence-driven contact, disciplined fire application. East Timor added urban stabilization under media scrutiny, where perception shaped strategic outcome as much as firepower. Together, they formed a pattern that would later confuse planners accustomed to equating capability with visible mass. The Americans who witnessed it often left with respect, sometimes admiration, but rarely with a clear framework for replication. They could describe what they saw. They struggled to institutionalize it. And so the laboratories remained unofficial. No curriculum written, no doctrinal annex labeled Australian method. Just results accumulating quietly across decades in environments where the assumptions of larger powers were subtly disproven, not through confrontation, but through demonstration. By the time later coalition operations would force the Pentagon to confront these differences more directly, the evidence had already been field-tested. In jungles thick with humidity and on streets still smoldering from political violence, something systematic had been operating beneath the surface of coalition business as usual. It had been there all along, waiting to be noticed. The tension didn't begin with gunfire, it began with paperwork. By the third operational quarter, the numbers were impossible to ignore. Australian patrol elements operating in the same contested valleys as larger American units were producing disproportionate results. Targeted detentions were cleaner, civilian complaint rates were lower. Follow-on insurgent retaliation was statistically reduced in sectors where Australian teams had led clearance and hold operations. In one 6-month window, their patrol-to-contact ratio was nearly half that of adjacent coalition forces. Fewer engagements, but higher yield outcomes, fewer firefights, more strategic effect. On the ground, the explanation felt obvious. Australian teams moved differently. They patrolled lighter. They leaned into human terrain mapping with a patience that bordered on stubbornness. They were comfortable operating in smaller elements, accepting calculated exposure to gather atmospherics rather than dominating space through visible force. Their rules of engagement were not softer, but they were applied with surgical discretion. Violence, when it came, was brief and decisive. But inside the coalition command architecture, fluorescent-lit operations centers layered with screens, digital overlays, and PowerPoint briefings, the interpretation was less flattering, because Australian success implied something uncomfortable. It suggested that the dominant coalition framework, the American framework, was not always the optimal one. In multinational task force meetings, the pressure arrived subtly. Standardization was the language, harmonization of reporting metrics, alignment of patrol templates, integration into broader maneuver, synchronization cycles. American doctrine favored scale brigade combat teams with layered ISR, predictable logistics chains, formalized targeting boards. Every action nested inside a system large enough to track, record, and justify itself. Australian commanders listened, they nodded, they returned to their sectors and continued operating as they always had. The friction was not ideological, it was structural. The United States military is a machine built for continental war logistics stretching across oceans, air dominance woven into every maneuver, sustainment pipelines capable of feeding divisions indefinitely. It measures success in grids and graphs, in tonnage delivered and terrain secured. Its doctrine is codified in volumes thick enough to stop a bullet. Australia's military, by necessity, is smaller, leaner, and culturally shaped by different conflicts. Its institutional memory leans heavily on regional operations, counterinsurgency pragmatism, and a professional ethos that prizes adaptability over uniformity. Where the American system seeks reproducibility at scale, the Australian approach tolerates variance if it produces effect. And variance makes large systems nervous. Inside a joint command cell one humid evening, an American colonel reviewed after-action summaries showing another Australian-led district stabilization effort completed with minimal kinetic engagement. He circled the numbers in red: lower munitions expenditure, lower visible presence, higher informant reliability within weeks. Then he asked the question that revealed the fault line. Why aren't they running it through the standardized target development cycle? Because the standardized cycle required time multiple approval layers, ISR confirmation thresholds, legal vetting windows. It produced accountability. It also produced degaltability. The Australians, operating within their own national caveats and command discretion, were collapsing that timeline when conditions allowed. From the American perspective, that looked like procedural risk. From the Australian perspective, it looked like operational competence. Pressure followed. Requests to adopt expanded reporting formats, invitations, thinly disguised directives to integrate into American battalion maneuver plans rather than run parallel frameworks, briefings emphasizing coalition unity. The subtext was clear: align more closely. Australian leadership responded with diplomacy sharpened by experience. They agreed where it cost nothing. They adjusted language in documentation. They attended synchronization meetings, but they resisted surrendering the core of their tactical autonomy. The choreography became delicate. Publicly, the alliance narrative remained immaculate. Joint press releases celebrated combined success. Training exercises were photographed from angles that erased divergence. On camera, generals spoke of seamless interoperability. Privately, conversations grew more candid. An Australian task group commander standing beneath the mechanical hum of a forward operating base generator explained to his American counterpart that forcing full procedural integration would degrade what was working. "You hired us for effect," he said quietly, "not for paperwork symmetry." The irony deepened with each passing month. American planners increasingly relied on Australian units to stabilize districts that had resisted heavier coalition footprints. When insurgent activity spiked in a particular corridor, it was often Australian teams who were asked to re-establish control, not through overwhelming presence but through calibrated engagement. They were, in effect, the coalition's scalpel. But scalpels do not fit easily into machinery designed for sledgehammers. Within American doctrinal institutions, absorbing the Australian model would have required more than tactical tweaks. It would have demanded cultural humility. It would have required admitting that smaller formations operating with greater autonomy and less bureaucratic layering could outperform larger, better-resourced units in certain environments, and large institutions struggle with that admission. Size confers capability, it also breeds inertia. The American militaries scale over 1 million active personnel at the height of the wars. A defense budget surpassing the next several nations combined creates gravitational pull. Doctrine evolves through committees. Lessons learned flow through formal channels, analyzed, validated, codified. By the time they emerge as revised field manuals, the battlefield may already have shifted. Australia's smaller force structure allows faster feedback loops. A tactic tested in one rotation can be adjusted in the next without navigating multiple congressional oversight layers or inter-service rivalries. This is not a matter of superiority, it is a matter of agility, and agility inside a coalition can feel like non-conformity. At one particularly tense coalition review, an American staff officer projected comparative engagement metrics onto a screen. The implication was unmistakable. Australian sectors were quieter, less kinetic, more stable. He framed it as evidence of coalition synergy. But beneath the surface, the data carried accusations. Why were American units absorbing higher contact rates in adjacent grids? Why did stabilization curves diverge so sharply? The room felt it. What could not be said outright was that American operational visibility, larger patrols, heavier vehicles, more overt dominance sometimes generated the very resistance it sought to suppress. Meanwhile, the Australian method of smaller, less intrusive engagement altered the psychological temperature of the battle space. To integrate that lesson fully would have required questioning assumptions embedded deep within American force projection identity, that presence equals control, that scale equals security, that procedural rigor equals legitimacy. Instead, compromise emerged. Australian units retained tactical discretion within defined sectors, while aligning enough administratively to satisfy coalition optics. American leadership continued to reference Australian effectiveness in briefings, even as doctrinal replication stalled. The relationship settled into a paradox. The United States military depended on Australian outcomes to stabilize fragile districts, to demonstrate coalition adaptability, to lower casualty projections in politically sensitive regions. Yet structurally, it could not fully internalize the source of that success without challenging its own doctrinal hierarchy. So the friction remained managed rather than resolved. For observers paying attention, the lesson extended beyond one theater of war. Institutional size brings unparalleled resources, but it can also harden identity. The larger the system, the more it must defend its internal coherence, analytical humility, especially when it implies learning from a smaller partner, becomes psychologically expensive. And here the frustration sharpens. Because war is indifferent to ego, terrain does not reward the better-funded doctrine, it rewards the more adaptive one. Insurgencies do not calibrate their response based on defense budgets. They exploit patterns, predictability, and pride. In quiet sectors where Australian patrols moved through dust-lit villages with minimal signature, the air felt different, less tense. Children emerged sooner from doorways. Informants lingered longer in conversation. The difference was not dramatic, it was subtle, but it accumulated. The American coalition management apparatus saw the results. It praised them. It cited them in internal reviews. Yet the deeper transformation, the willingness to let a smaller ally reshape aspects of operational philosophy, remained constrained. The world's most resourced military found itself in an uncomfortable position, reliant on a partner whose effectiveness exposed its own doctrinal rigidity. That is institutional friction at its most revealing. Not loud, not explosive. Just two philosophies operating side by side, one learning rapidly, the other protecting its structure. And in that tension lies a question that stretches far beyond the single conflict. When power becomes vast enough to shape the world, does it remain nimble enough to learn from those who fight beside it? It did not begin with an apology. It began with a footnote. Buried inside a revised counterinsurgency annex circulated through U.S. Special Operations channels in the late 2000s was a subtle shift in language. The phrasing moved away from area dominance through sustained presence and toward persistent micro-engagement and intelligence-led disruption. It recommended smaller patrol elements operating beyond conventional support radii. It emphasized night movement without illumination, decentralized target development, and embedding long enough to understand village power structures at the family level. There was no citation, no flag, no acknowledgement that much of it had already been practiced, refined, and blood-tested for years by the Special Air Service Regiment. The irony was surgical. For decades, American operational culture had equated scale with seriousness. Battalion sweeps, visible armored convoys, air support stacked overhead. The sound of rotors announced intent before boots touched soil. Power projected outward, loud and unmistakable. The Australians had moved differently. In the river valleys of Afghanistan, they often deployed patrols of 4 to 6 operators where American doctrine preferred platoon strength. Their loads were lighter, their insertion profiles quieter. They would sit on a ridgeline for 48 hours without transmitting, mapping patterns of life down to which child carried water at dusk. When they struck, it was surgical. One compound, one facilitator, then silence again. An American major once described watching them operate as like observing gravity instead of weather. There was no spectacle, just inevitable pressure applied at exactly the right points. At first, that difference had irritated senior planners. Smaller units meant greater perceived risk. Less visible presence meant less reassurance to local officials. And when metrics were tallied, square kilometers cleared, villages visited, patrol hours logged, the Australians often reported lower raw numbers. But the second column told a different story. Civilian casualty ratios consistently lower. Intelligence yields per patrol disproportionately higher. Repeat insurgent activity in cleared zones measurably reduced within weeks instead of months. In some districts, American battalions rotated through 800-man footprints with limited durable effect. A rotating Australian element of fewer than 200 operators achieved longer stabilization windows in adjacent terrain. The numbers were not dramatic enough for headlines, but they were persistent enough to become uncomfortable. The first formal acknowledgement came, disguised as collaboration. Joint task force briefings began assigning Australian elements to shape the battlefield before larger U.S. operations. Quietly, they were moved upstream in the operational hierarchy. Instead of following, they prepared. Within the Five Eyes intelligence community, an alliance linking the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand Australian reporting began carrying disproportionate operational weight in specific theaters, not because of political leverage, because their human intelligence pipelines were deeper. Their pattern of life analysis is more granular. Their target packages are cleaner. Inside American Special Operations schools, curriculum revisions followed. Instructors began emphasizing terrain intimacy. Students were evaluated on their ability to operate independently beyond immediate QRF coverage. Case studies highlighted low-visibility disruption operations. The language echoed Australian after-action reports almost verbatim, but the source remained unnamed. This was not theft, it was institutional digestion, a quiet borrowing that allowed adaptation without conceding that a smaller ally had outperformed certain frameworks. There was a scene in Uruzgan province that circulated informally among officers. An American company had spent weeks attempting to neutralize an IED cell operating along a supply route. Air surveillance failed to produce actionable leads. Informants contradicted each other. Patrols drew sporadic fire but no decisive contact. An Australian patrol inserted at dusk. 4 men. No convoy. No drone overhead. They watched. For 3 nights nothing moved. On the 4th, a single motorcycle left a compound at Sortu 200, headlights off. The patrol did not intercept immediately. They tracked, identified a secondary meeting point, waited for confirmation. When they acted, they detained 2 facilitators and seized materials linking the cell to a regional financier. The route went quiet within 10 days. That micro-operation never made a press release, but it circulated in PowerPoint slides inside American headquarters. Outcome metrics do not care about national pride. By 2012, American special operations teams were increasingly operating in smaller, more autonomous elements in certain regions. The shift was framed as adaptive evolution, which it was. But it was also an imitation. And imitation is a form of admission, yet the admission never matured into conversation. No joint doctrinal symposium publicly credited Australian methodology as a structural influence. No formal reform declared that large footprint counterinsurgency had overestimated its own efficiency in specific terrains. Bureaucracies rarely narrate their own corrections. Instead, the elevation was subtle. Australian officers found themselves granted earlier input in campaign design meetings. Their target development models were circulated as best practice examples. Within coalition hierarchies, their units were increasingly trusted with shaping operations before American forces scaled them. Vindication arrived in access, not applause, but the reversal was incomplete, because while tactical borrowing occurred, institutional gravity remained. The American military machine, global, immense, budgeted in the hundreds of billions, cannot fully restructure around a methodology optimized for small-team intimacy without altering its own identity. Scale is both its strength and its inertia, and so the gap remained. Acknowledgement without reform, borrowing without attribution, respect without public reckoning. For Australian operators, the recognition was tangible but quiet. More requests for joint planning. Greater influence in intelligence fusion cells. Their casualty ratios and operational timelines were studied rather than dismissed, but there was no moment of triumph, because vindication that arrives through silence carries its own weight. They had proven that with fewer boots, fewer vehicles, and fewer public declarations, outcomes could be shaped more precisely. They had demonstrated that presence does not require spectacle, that disruption can be more durable than domination. America eventually admitted it, just not out loud. And perhaps that is the most honest ending. Institutions rarely transform because they were wrong. They adapt because reality leaves them no choice. The conversation about scale versus intimacy, visibility versus inevitability, remains unresolved. It lives in training evolutions, in quiet curriculum edits, in which partner gets asked to shape the terrain before the brigade arrives. Vindication came, but reform did not. And in that unfinished space between learning and admitting lies the real legacy of what Australia forced a superpower to recognize.